lecture, obviously, and we are doing it via Skype. And we are also taping it at the same time. So I'm a bit excited. This is the closest thing to neurosurgery that I've been to. And I hope that this goes well. Our last speaker is Bob Jessop, currently in England. And he will be giving a talk entitled States and State Power, a Strategic Relational Approach. So I don't want to waste any more time, and I will now give a word to Professor Jessop. Afterwards, we can have also a discussion via Skype if the connection lasts that long. So I think that all the technical prerequisites are in order, and I think we can begin. Professor Jessop.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for agreeing to listen to my presentation via Skype. I'm very sorry that I wasn't with you for the last 2 days, but I was unable to participate, but I'm aware of the lecturers who've already spoken to you. In fact, I know them all very well as personal friends, so I can imagine some of the conversations that you've had. Because I'm not with you in person, although I have a long PowerPoint presentation, I'll try to keep my presentation fairly brief to enable you to have a proper question and answer session, because I think that's a more useful way to take advantage of my presence via Skype than for me to give you a long lecture. I've already agreed that the PowerPoint presentation could be made available to you later, so you don't need to make extensive notes, but just try to concentrate on the points that I'm making and where you agree or disagree and would like to ask questions. So you've seen the front page, and this is the outline of the full presentation. Not necessarily what it is that I'm going to say this afternoon, but some pointers perhaps for you to think about at a later stage. So I'm first going to ask the question asked of almost anybody who declares themselves to be a state theorist, which is, well, exactly what is the state? And I think that many state theorists will admit that this is the most difficult question that they have to confront. So I'll spend some time discussing the nature of the state and state power, and in that context refer to the difference between national and nation states, an important issue for thinking about the nature of the European Union, and also for thinking about the impact of globalization or internationalization or transnationalization on the form of the state and on state capacity in the current period. I'm then going to ask what I think is a very useful question, originally posed by Evgeny Pashukanis, a Russian Marxist lawyer and state theorist, about the particular form of the capitalist state, and provide some initial answers. I'm then going to note some limits of this kind of form analysis and move to the work of Gramsci and Foucault, and then the work of Poulantzas and the ways in which I've developed the ideas of Gramsci, Foucault, Poulantzas, and many others. Namely, I shall be introducing the strategic relational approach, and then I'll be indicating some ways in which it might be applied. So we'll move to the next slide now. The question, what is the state? I've been working on state theory since 1974, more years than I care to remember. And after many attempts to identify a good entry point, I've come back to a view associated with what the Germans call allgemeine Staatslehre, and which can simply be called general state theory. And what that identified three aspects of the formal characteristics of the state, namely that the state has a territory controlled by that state, it has an apparatus that makes collectively binding or authoritative decisions, and it makes them over a resident population subject to state authority. Perhaps several of you, many of you even, may be familiar with that from the work of Max Weber or from law or from more contemporary theories. That said, it's quite clear state capacities and state strength vary a great deal. There's obviously no general form of the state, and in particular, there are very big differences even within the same broad kind of state, let us say a capitalist state, in their policy regimes, and that indicates that there can be no general theory of the state in general. Perhaps in the United Nations, and not even there, all states are equal. But as George Orwell would perhaps have said, while all states are equal, some are more equal than others. And that's an additional issue for those interested in state theory, namely to explain why some states have more power than others to shape the world order, and in addition to explain the bases of state strength, which are not merely in terms of welfare, but also in terms of military power. I'm now going to offer a definition of statehood, of the general characteristics of the state. The Germans refer to this as Staatlichkeit. Statehood is not such a common word in English. And we can say that statehood is territorialized political power, and I will just invite you to read the paragraph that's there in the middle of the slide. And as you read it, emphasize every one of the terms that's written there in italics is contested, either theoretically or indeed in terms of everyday political struggles and in terms of ruptural moments. We're even coming up with a very general definition of the state or general definition of statehood doesn't take us very far. It helps us to identify the points of contestation, the points of struggle in relation to the state and state power. It doesn't establish a definition or a reference point that can simply thereafter be taken for granted. Now I'm coming to the national state and the nation state. In many European languages, there's a failure to distinguish between the nation state and the national state. And I think this is a major problem, not only in dealing with the territorialization of political power, but also seeing it's at stake when one discusses the nature of the European Union as a state in the process of formation, for example. So a national state, signified here by the frontispiece of Hobbes's Leviathan, can be described as a sovereign territorial state constituted on the basis of a successful claim, internally and externally, to exercise the legitimate monopoly of organized violence in its territory and to use it to govern its population. There are many national states, but not all national states are nation states. Next slide, please. And here I would identify or define a nation state as a territorial state constituted on the basis of an existing nation or one that seeks to legitimize territorialization of political power on its claim to form a nation, an imagined community. Not all nation states or potential nation states on national states. In the current era, or the current period, for example, Kurdistan, which is potentially a nation state, is divided among 3 national states, each of which has very distinct views on whether or not the Kurds have a right to nationhood. If one looks at the very strong sense of Kurdish national identity, clearly there is at least the basis of a legitimate claim there. And I'm speaking to you, of course, in the former Yugoslavia, which was a multinational state and broke up over issues of national identity, even though Yugoslavia was a national state in terms of national territorial statehood. Now I'm moving to the slide on the European Union, and we can ask, in the light of the features that I've identified of states, national states, and nation states, where does the European Union fit in? And of course, you've heard John Cananculan and Jens Wissel talk about this already, and I believe from the abstract that Werner Bonefeld has also spoken on this. From my viewpoint, the European Union is a state in the process of formation. That is to say, it's an attempt to establish a new mode of the territorialization of political power, a new mode of territorialization that differs from empire or multinational or federal states. It's neither a national sovereign state nor a nation state. It's acquiring more formal powers, and efforts are being made to create a European cultural and political identity. And you will have heard from John and from Jens in their respective presentations about all of the different struggles that are taking place around the nature of the European Union, about the class interests, fractional interests that it might represent, and about the nature of the powers and capacities of that state and the extent to which it should develop a national identity and so forth. The authority in the European Union is based on treaties among national states, with new member states required to accept the status quo without the right to challenge it. But the treaties are also unequal in that they're not negotiated between equal states, but some states, as I've indicated, are more influential in these regards than others. And the other point I want to make here is that if one thinks of the traditional definitions of the state, or one tries to interpret the European Union in terms of some 19th century notion of a sovereign state, we won't get very far. It seems very unusual. But if you look at the ways in which states have been changing, the rise of authoritarian statism, the increased importance of laws and of information, of governance rather than government in managing states, then it looks to be more like an attempt to rescale the actually existing state than to resurrect and to revive a 19th century kind of national sovereign state in which government is the main basis for the exercise of state power. I'm now moving to the next slide. And here, I just want to point out, I won't discuss this in more detail, that there are many ways in which one can discuss and explore the state. And I think that, or my firm belief is that there is, as I've said, no general theory of the state, and there can be no general method or general best approach to the analysis of the state. Depending on the particular questions that you're interested in, different approaches would be appropriate. And the challenge in this context is for a state theorist to develop a set of concepts, a set of approaches that are useful in dealing with all of these different sets of questions and approaches. I'm now moving to the next slide, which is the question posed by Evgeny Pashukanis, who asked, why does the dominance of a class take the form of official state domination? Or, which is the same thing, why is the mechanism of state constraint not created as the private mechanism of the dominant class? Why is it dissociated from the dominant class, taking the form of an impersonal mechanism of public authority, isolated from society? Now, of course, this is not a question about states in general. It's a question about the historical specificity of the capitalist type of state. It's a question about why the ideal, typical, or the normal form of the capitalist state is one in which it appears that the people are sovereign. There is an equal share in the exercise of power in taking the form of impersonal sovereign authority, rather than a court or a narrow clique of slaveholders or feudal lords and so forth. And it's a very important and interesting question to pose. Moving on to the next slide. Marx in Capital says that the form of sovereign authority, the form of the state, corresponds to the form of economic organization. And we can answer Pashukanis' question in these terms. The unique feature of capitalism is that the commodity form is generalized to labor power in the form of the wage relation. Surplus labor can be appropriated as surplus value rather than coerced surplus labor. And in that sense, exploitation can take the form of exchange, the words in the labor market. And as Stanley Moore, summarizing the essence of the Marxist theory of the state, says, where exploitation takes the form of exchange, dictatorship may, I emphasize here, may take the form of democracy. But what that means is that liberal democracy may occur as long as economic and political class struggles are separated, the former being subject to the logic of the market, the latter to the logic of liberal democracy. And that possibility depends on the balance of forces. An additional point that I want to make in the light of many discussions recently about post-democracy, for example, in the work of Colin Crouch, but in earlier work, for example, of Poulantzas or Habermas, or going back to the Frankfurt School, there is a question whether or not liberal democracy can survive the development of a much more politically mediated form of capital accumulation. And I'm thinking particularly here of neoliberalism, which appears to worship market forces, but which in fact is very, very heavily dependent on continuing state intervention and increasingly tight connections between economic and political struggle, for example, now in the forms of neoliberal austerity, which suggests that Pashukanis' question, even when posed in the 1920s, may no longer be as relevant. It's now a debatable point whether or not we are still witnessing or observing, even in the advanced capitalist economies, the impersonal authority of a sovereign state apparatus, or that the state is changing in important and interesting ways. I'm now moving to the next slide. One of the implications of Pashukanis's question and the gloss that I've just given to it about whether or not his question is still valid is the importance for his question to be answered in the terms that I've just presented, whether or not the separation between the economic and politics, market and state are valid and can be reproduced. You will probably have heard this morning from Werner Bonafelt, who is very, very critical of the fetishization of the separation of the economic and the political, and in his own work, including his very recent book on critical theory, emphasizes that the separation between the economic and the political is an important source of mystification, fetishization, and debasement of the population. And I certainly endorse the view that it's important, even though in actually existing societies, it appears that economy and politics, that it appears that market and state are separate. We have to see that this is a fetishized illusion produced in and through quite specific economic, political, and other practices. And state power, even though it appears to be distinct from the economic, is integral to the reproduction of the capital relation, which depends on a strategic use of economic and extra-economic resources. And any sensible, worthwhile theory of the capitalist type of state, or indeed states in capitalist societies, must take account of this fetishized separation, which, as John Holloway and Werner Bonafelt in their earlier work have described as a separation in unity rather than an absolute separation of the economic and the political. I'm now moving to the next slide. What that means is that for the reproduction of bourgeois domination, the reproduction of the legitimacy of the capitalist type of state, then it's important from a bourgeois viewpoint that the struggles of subordinate classes are kept in separate boxes. Economic struggles subject to the logic of the market, and political struggles subject to the logic of electoral majorities and so forth. Of course, the bourgeoisie itself doesn't obey the same principle of separation other than as a source of legitimation, but deploys economic and political resources skillfully, strategically, in order to advance its particular fractional or collective interests. I'm moving to the next slide. And this is simply a listing of 5 characteristics of the normal kind of state that I invite you to think about and look at later. I want to move on in order to save time and move towards other arguments. So the next slide concerns liberal bourgeois democracy and why it might consider to be adequate, but I've already given you a brief explanation of that. The next slide is a quotation from Marx, which reinforces that point, and again I invite you to look at that later. The slide on the tax state is interesting because the bourgeois form of taxation is very different from earlier ways of raising taxes. It appears to be very impersonal, it's imposed on everybody equally, but, and this is the important point, the bourgeois tax state should be able to raise taxes on all political subjects, all citizens, and all organizations within its territory in equal terms, what we're seeing today, again, is a retreat from this normal form. It now seems that taxes paid by transnational companies, Apple, Google, others are merely well-known examples, that taxes are almost a voluntary topic for transnational firms and are subject to negotiation between the firm and the state rather than being subject to imposition. And this is just one more illustration of the ways in which the normal form of the capitalist type of state is being dismantled as a result of globalization. I'm now moving to the next slide. And this is a very brief contrast between the capitalist type of state, the one that conforms to Pashukarnas' question, what is the, or rather why is the exercise of authority in the capitalist type of state taking the form of an impersonal authority? And you can begin to answer that question along the lines indicated on the left-hand side of that presentation. The most important point that I want to make is the one at the bottom of that left-hand column, that in a capitalist type of state, class power is structural, it's impersonal, it doesn't appear to be class power. That's the answer to Pashukarnas' question. And it tends to be obscure or seen as legitimate. In actual fact, if you look at the over 170, possibly over 180 member states of the United Nations as illustrations of national territorial states, very few of them actually conform to the capitalist type of state, to the normal type of state. Most of them are, in fact, states in capitalist society. And in those contexts, class power is much more contingent. It's openly instrumental or mediated by other relations, but most observers, most persons, citizens, organizations subject to the power not of the capitalist type of state, but the state in capitalist society, will be absolutely clear that power is not being exercised by an impersonal authority. Even if it's the state acting in the name of the national state that's exercising power, it's not the state that's doing this to them, but the state as the instrument or the mediating force in much more self-evidently class-biased, ethnically biased, racially biased, or other forms of oppression and discrimination. So I want to suggest here that there are actually limits to form analysis. And now moving on to, yes, I want to move to the slide that is beyond form analysis. And here it is a quotation from the work of Nikos Poulantzas, State, Power, Socialism. And I'm sure that you already heard about this from John and from Jens. You may have heard it criticized by Werner Bonafelt, who, if not in his own name, but those with whom he works, has criticized Poulantzas for being far too concerned with the specifically political character of class domination and not looking more generally at the way in which class power is exercised. That said, Poulantzas wrote that it is better to see the state as a relationship of forces, or more precisely, the material condensation of such a relationship among classes and class fractions, such as this is expressed in the state in a necessarily specific form. What Poulantzas is doing here is to define, in fact, not the state, but state power. And for Poulantzas and for many other critical state theorists, it is more important to examine state power than it is to examine the form of the state. A possible reason for that I gave you in the distinction that I drew between the capitalist type of state and the state in capitalist societies. And now moving on to the next slide, which I think reinforces that point, and also the distinction that I drew earlier between the capitalist type of state, or the normal form of the capitalist type of state, and exceptional regimes. This distinction is one that also derives from the work of Nikos Poulantzas. Normal states are those where formal democracy, formal sovereignty exercised in the name of the people is present. Exceptional states abolish elections except for plebiscites and referenda, and a series of other characteristics are there as well. And one of Poulantzas's arguments is not only have there historic periods such as fascism, Italian fascism, German Nazism, military dictatorships in Greece, Spain, Portugal, as specific moments or conjunctures in the history of capitalist societies, but there is an increasing tendency towards exceptionalism even within normal states, something he refers to as authoritarian statism. And again, I'm pretty sure that John and Jens in their presentations will have told you something about that. And if there's time, I'll come to that in my own presentation. If not, there are a couple of slides in the presentation that address that issue. The important point here is that normal states tend to be much more stable and much more flexible in adjusting to shocks, to crises, whereas exceptional regimes are much more brittle and therefore need to resort far more to coercion and other forms of constraining, controlling, limiting popular resistance. The next slide is just an elaboration of Poulantzas's arguments illustrating the difference between military dictatorships and fascism. I won't take that further here. Again, that's something for you to look at and think about later. I now want to move, and this is the slide on Gramsci, to the significance of Gramsci's work in the light of my previous remarks, because Gramsci is very little interested, either historically or in the particular conjuncture in which he wrote, in the form of the state. He's much more interested in the modalities of the exercise of state power. He doesn't look at its specific institutional mediations. He looks beyond the state in its juridico-political sense to examine power as a relation. And if he finds the state in its integral sense as political society plus civil society, and defines or interprets state power in the West as hegemony armored by coercion. But it's also important to note that he has a very specific definition of force and of hegemony, not normal, if you like, everyday or commonsensical definitions, but definitions that fit in with his interest in how class power is reproduced. And he describes force as the use of a coercive apparatus to bring the popular masses into conformity with the requirements of a specific mode of production. So it's not random, unstructured violence, but the use of coercion with a quite specific state project, class project in mind. And hegemony is where the ruling class mobilizes the active consent of dominated groups via intellectual, moral, and political leadership. And clearly, force and hegemony differ in their significance in capitalist societies, and he also mentions fraud, corruption, passive revolution, and other modalities of the exercise of state power. And what I want to suggest is not only is this a very interesting entry point into thinking about state power, but it can be linked to the work of Michel Foucault. I've got some slides later that I won't discuss, but which establish or reinforce this claim that one might usefully link the work of Foucault with that of Gramsci and Poulanzas. What I want to suggest is, rather than taking Gramsci's definition, the state equals political society plus civil society, as the basis for our analyses, I'm not suggesting that's wrong. There's another way we can think about it that might help to enrich that analysis or definition of the integral state. We can think about the state also as government plus governance in the shadow of hierarchy. Just to reiterate, political society plus civil society armored by coercion, government plus governance in the shadow of hierarchy. Now, as already indicated, government is more than the state, considered as territory, apparatus, population. It exercises power in ways that go well beyond imperative coordination. Gramsci's point about political society plus civil society. And government as a social relation, hegemony armored by coercion, involves practices that go well beyond the state. It's an attempt to juggle, to re-articulate, to recombine in different contexts for different purposes at different times, governmental power, imperative coordination, law, with other ways of influencing, shaping, directing, normalizing society to bring it into conformity, as Gramsci would say, with the requirements of the dominant mode of production and the forms that it takes. Moving on quickly to the next slide, what I want to suggest is that Foucault, if we look even beginning with Discipline and Punish, but even more, the lectures that he gave at the Collège de France, has already moved well away from an emphasis on the microphysics of power to see how the state is colonizing the wider society. And this is reinforced if we move to the next slide, that Foucault, this is the second bullet point, Foucault reintroduces the state after having rejected examination of the state. He says, actually, the state is the key site for the strategic codification of power relations. He's not reviving Marxism, nor is he reviving a juridical analysis of the state, but what he's saying is that the state, rather than the original subject, the prime mover in society, the state is an effect of changes in government practices. State power is an effect of lines of force, lines of flight within and across the state in its inclusive sense. I rephrased Foucault slightly, but not a great deal. And you should be able to see then the extent to which his analysis matches or coincides, that doesn't match, but is complementary to, rather than contradictory to, the ideas of Gramsci or of Poulanzas. I'm going to slip the next slide, which is on governments and governmentality, and move now to the strategic relational approach. The idea that the state can be seen as a social relation. This really is a paraphrase of Nikos Poulanzas, that the state is not a thing, nor is it a rational subject, even though in everyday language we say the state does this, the state does that, as if it's an acting, willing subject. It's not a subject, nor is it simply a thing, an instrument, but it can be seen as an ensemble or an assemblage of institutions and organizations that exercises power to the extent that it does so successfully through an institutionally mediated condensation of a changing balance of forces. And this, of course, is Poulanzas, it's Gramsci, it's Foucault, it goes back to Marx's work as well. And as well as its articulation to the economic base, in other words, its functions in reproducing capital accumulation, it also has a broader significance in relation to the wider society. And in those terms, not only is it important in reproducing and maintaining economic exploitation, it's vital, it's essential to the reproduction of socio-political domination. And this occurs through the selective impact of state forms on the shaping of political opportunities and alliances, and through specific state strategies, projects, and policies. I was very jealous when I was being introduced at the T-shirt worn by the person who introduced me. Because on the back of his T-shirt in Portuguese is seleção, which means selection. So that T-shirt is one that I will try to obtain from somewhere, because it brings out very, very clearly the key word for the strategic relational theory or approach to the state, the importance of selection, of selectivity. And if we take this viewpoint seriously, that what the state power is a condensation, institutionally mediated, of a much wider balance of forces oriented to the exercise of state capacities, to the transformation of the state, we can begin to rethink the Gramsci definition along the lines that I suggested, that the state is government plus governance in the shadow of hierarchy, that government is more than the state, that government is a social relation, that it is involved in juggling different forms of governance in the context of an unstable equilibrium of compromise. I'm now moving to the next slide, and this summarizes briefly in relation to earlier arguments the strategic relational approach. The state's historical constitution, if we look at the state as a state in capitalist society, or its formal constitution, if we look at the state as a capitalist type of state, as spatio-temporally specific patterns of what I call structurally inscribed strategic selectivity. These are the product of past struggles, and they also shape the capacity to engage in present struggles. Political forces attempt to develop their strategies in the light of these selectivities and in the light of shifting conjunctures. I move to the next slide, which I'm now going to say, read that later. Move on to the next slide, which is the one labeled state power or state powers. Because I want to supplement the previous argument that we should be looking at state power as our primary focus rather than the state, by saying that actually state power is itself in need of disaggregation, of decomposition. If we see the state, as Poulanzas suggests, as an ensemble of power centers and capacities, rather than as an already unified state, then we have to understand it in terms of an assemblage. Its powers, there isn't a single power of the state, its powers in plural are activated by changing sets of politicians and officials located in specific sites, acting in specific conjunctures with specific horizons of action. And again, I'm not sure what Werner said this morning, but I'm pretty sure that John and Jens would have been telling you about the different ways in which state power within the European Union is fragmented in different policy areas, associated with different alliances of forces, with potentially different fractional interests and so forth. And what that means is, even though it's perhaps state managers that formally are responsible for the exercise of state power, it's certainly not the case that those insiders are totally separate from and insulated from the wider society, and they're certainly not acting purely in their own name, but they're acting, at least in the medium to long term, in terms of their links through to the wider balance of forces. I'm now moving to the next slide. And I suppose this is just my defense of Poulanzas against the past charges of politicism or an overemphasis on the political. Because Poulanzas is quite clear, and I endorse that view, that the state is merely one of the modalities in which through domination is exercised. It has an important part in economic and ideological domination more generally, and Poulanzas offers us a number of concepts for thinking about that, which I'm sure again you will have heard about yesterday. The ruling class, class in charge of the state, supporting classes, bureaucrats, social forces, and so forth. Moving on, I think I'll skip this slide, which is the wider nature for Poulanzas of domination, political, ideological domination, and the possibilities that these are not synchronized, mutually reinforcing, but can become out of synchronization. My next slide is 6 dimensions of state power, which is an attempt to bridge formal analysis and the analysis of the substantive or power aspect. And I distinguish 3 formal aspects: forms of representation, the overall institutional architecture of the state, and forms of state intervention. Mainstream political science, legal analysis, constitutional theorists are interested mostly in the formal aspects. A Poulanzasian, Gramscian, Foucauldian, Jessopian, but perhaps I should say originally Marxian analysis also looks at the social bases for state projects that attempt to unify the state, because it is merely an ensemble or assemblage of different organizations, apparatuses, power centers, and so forth. And finally, the attempt of the state to try to order civil society. The next slide presents this in more detail. I won't deal with it here. That's the formal aspects. And moving on again, the next slide gives you the substantive definitions. Both of those slides bring in, on the right side, the aspects of crisis. So there is no argument that if we look at the state or social bases, there is a presumption that this all works smoothly and without crises. Each of those 6 moments can itself be taken as an entry point into the analysis of crisis. And again, I invite you to look at that in detail later. I think in the interest of your sanity, just watching me on a screen rather than me walking around and being animated, I'll take another 5 minutes and then we'll move to question and answer. So the next slide concerns how we might apply some of these ideas drawn from Pashukanis, from Poulanzas, from Gramsci, from Foucault, in actual cases. We've already had a really excellent presentation from John and Jens on this, drawing on their 3, possibly 4-year research project and some of their published work. And I will take that as an interesting illustration of ways in which a Ulanzasian or strategic relational analysis can be applied. So how one would apply the SRA? We must first of all see the present historical or formal character results from past struggles and is reproduced and transformed in and through a wide range of political struggles. The balance of forces is modified through shifts in the strategic terrain of the state, economy and wider social formation, as well as by changes in organization, strategy and tactics. And the effectiveness of state power depends not just on the institutional forms, the capacities, the state projects, but also, and of course, on the different forms of compliance and resistance. State power is a social relation. It depends upon not only the attempt of the state to exercise power, but its ability to project that power into wider society and to overcome resistance. In order to apply the strategic relational approach, we have also to go beyond a general analysis of the state or class power, to consider it in relation to specific substantive policy fields, noting, of course, that the differences between policy fields, economic welfare policy, technology policy, innovation policy, competitiveness policy, and so forth, are not God-given distinctions, but only socially and technically constitute. And again, John and Jens have probably discussed policy fields in their presentation yesterday. We must also go beyond the naturalization, the taken for grantedness of the national territorial state, to include interstate relations, the scalar division of political labor, the local, the regional, the national, the European, cross-border relations, and so forth, as well as the nature of networks, for example, networks of global cities, connections among places. And in addition to looking at territorial sovereignty, we need to consider temporal sovereignty. How easy is it for the state and the forces that it represents to make decisions according to specifically political rhythms? In the North Atlantic financial crisis, when that crisis broke out, the time of Black Friday, the following Monday, Tim Geithner went to Congress and said, this is the targeted asset relief program. Unless you pass this legislation today, the stock market will collapse tomorrow. That is a perfect illustration of the denial of temporal sovereignty to the state. It's a clear, even if you consider for the moment Congress and the House of Representatives, Senate, democratic, it's a taking away of democratic or political sovereignty, because democracy takes time. And this was a gun to the head of Congress people saying, pass this legislation or else. And as crises become more acute, become more urgent, more and more power is being taken away from the state as it loses temporal sovereignty. There are many examples of that in the unfolding of the European crisis. And we can understand that, this is the next slide, in terms of the world market and the world of states. As the world market becomes more integrated, it, as Marx points out, generalizes and intensifies the contradictions and crisis tendencies of accumulation on a world scale. But nonetheless, accumulation occurs in a world of states, not under the command or influence of a more or less unified world state. And this is a further source of pressures on state territorial sovereignty and state temporal sovereignty. I'm now moving on to the next slide, and in the interest of getting to a speedy conclusion, I'm going quickly to move to the slide that begins economic state of emergency. It's slide 45. If you can get there, there were some previous slides intervening or commenting on much earlier debates. I want to suggest here, and I'm almost finished now, is that as a result of increasing world market integration, as a result of the increasing generalization and intensification of the contradictions of capital accumulation, we're moving to a situation where not only are there political or military states of emergency, but increasingly of economic states of emergency. And these generally require urgent action to manage the crisis, and that leads to the granting of generous discretionary powers to the state to solve the crisis, because exceptional measures require urgent, timely, targeted action. And this is one more way in which the state is losing any territorial, sovereign, temporal authority that it had. Moving on again, we come to what the Germans would call my Lieblingsstaatstheoretiker, my all-time favorite state theorist, Nikos Poulasas, who already in 1974, that is to say 40 years ago, was talking about the rise of authoritarian statism, intensified state control over every sphere of socio-economic life, combined with the radical decline of the institutions of political democracy, and with draconian and multiform curtailment of so-called formal liberties. This was 40 years ago, and one can really only say that he was very far-sighted indeed and understands what's going on far better than Colin Crouch with his work on post-democracy. The next slide just spells out in more detail 4 specific features of authoritarian statism, and I'm now going to get to my conclusion, which is, firstly, that state theorists study the state, or the states, mainly in scientific terms, although this always occurs in the shadow of ideological influences, even sometimes under direct pressure. But that as citizens of the world, we shouldn't just take an impartial, impersonal viewpoint, but we should also consider this from the viewpoint of state builders, including those who seek another state. And where what state builders are interested in doing is creating, changing, transforming the state in terms of their hopes and expectations, their new political utopias, their new visions, their alternative ideas about what is feasible in the future, what exists in potentia that could be realized through skillful or skilled strategic action. Scientific analysis can give you some view of the past, possibly of the present, but scientific analysis tells us very little about the future. And therefore, any serious engagement with the state requires not only that we think about the state in scientific terms, and I've indicated some ways in which that can be done, but it also requires us to take the viewpoint of state builders, and how we would like ourselves to intervene in the present, to think about strategies for transformation of the state. And what that means is that a full account of the state needs to combine the true and the false, sorting out useful, scientifically valid propositions about it from ideological mystifications or just sheer nonsense on the one hand, but also to take the viewpoint of the correct and incorrect. How does one read the conjuncture? What's there in potentia? What is the current balance of forces? Is this an offensive or a defensive phase in which we are located, and so forth? And that was the ambition, to see what's there in potentia
based on their scientific analyses of a Machiavelli, a Marx, a Lenin, a Gramsci, and so forth, up to and including the present day. And that's the end of my presentation. You might want a short break, and then we can move to question and answer. And thank you very much so far for your attention. Because I can see you sitting down, I can only assume at this distance you've been quite attentive and following either the slides or myself with at least a modicum of interest, and I thank you for that because I'm not there in person. So thanks.
Thank you, Bob. We will not have a break. We will continue with the questions immediately if you can hear us.
Yes, I can still hear.
Take a couple of questions, and then you can comment or give an answer to depending on the type of question.
Okay.
So I open the floor for any kind of comments or questions for Bob with regard to his lecture. Maybe I can start before the audience warms up. So,
yeah, could you introduce, if you could introduce yourself when you speak? Yes, I know who Son is, but not the others.
Yeah, you communicated via email with Stipe and Sana.
Yes.
Okay, my name is Mislav, also from the Centar for Labor Studies. Mm-hmm. And I'll start with two questions. You've mentioned tax state at one of your slides, and that reminded me of the latest book by Gobernantzaren. Maybe you've had a chance to read it. The title is Buying Time, and he has in this book this sequence of state transformation, as it were. So his claim is that the state has moved from tax state to debt state to what he refers to as consolidation state, and he reads this as a way in which capitalism buys time. So he's actually, although I think he's more of a mainstream theoretician coming from the varieties of capitalism tradition, he actually employs some of the Marxian concepts of, basically Marxian theory of history, in which, of course, capitalism in the end kind of dissolves. So I was wondering, can you comment on this general thesis that this move and this transformation is actually, or could be read as something that is potentially threatening to the capitalist order as he sees it? That would be one question. And the second question is with regard to the relationship between Foucault and Gramsci that you mentioned. And I want to kind of emphasize that the reception of Foucauldian lectures on biopolitics was kind of ambivalent. Some critics, such as Philip Mirovsky, were actually pointing out to this ambivalence in Foucault's treatment of the state and market, and he actually claims that there is a great asymmetry when Foucault talks about the state and when he talks about the market, in the sense that he actually buys into the liberal story about the market and actually accepts this notion that market is a site of jurisdiction, as he puts it, and that makes it a kind of if we accept this as a hypothesis, that makes it kind of difficult to to link Foucault, and if this is true, it makes it kind of difficult to link Foucault and Marxian tradition. So, and you kind of hinted that this could be done. So perhaps some further elaboration on that particular thesis. So that would be my first two introductory questions.
Okay, thank you very much for both of them. Yes, I am familiar with Wolfgang Streeck's work. I spent some time at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne,
where Wolfgang Streeck is the co-director. I have an opportunity to discuss his book with him in other contexts as well. And I think in order to understand where that text comes from, we need to consider his position over many years and the extent to which the North Atlantic financial crisis represents a shock to his received opinion. Generally speaking, within the context of nature of understanding capitalism, nature of understanding social relations within capitalism and so forth, Wolfgang Streeck has tended to take a position that there are different varieties of capitalism and that the German variety is actually superior to the liberal market capitalisms that one finds in the United States or the United Kingdom. And much of his work, both his theoretical work and his empirical work, has been concerned with defining and defending the historical specificity of the German model, das Modell Deutschland, but also with making recognitions on how its competitiveness, its economic performance can be improved in the present conjuncture, whenever that is, which is why, if you look at his role from, say, 2000 to 2010, he actually sided with a more neoliberal austerity policy, somebody who was in fact tending to support the idea of neoliberal modernization, neoliberal competitiveness, and so forth. He was one of the key players in the development of the Hartz labor market reforms and so forth, but all within the context of thinking about the German model as opposed to others. When I spent some time in the Max Planck Institute, it was clear that his position was changing, because rather than Germany performing far better than other economies after the North Atlantic financial crisis, Germany was being affected as much as other tight capitalism around the world economy. And at that time, he was in New York, and he began to read the work of Schumpeter, Goldschmidt, and so forth on the tax state, on the fiscal state, and organized a conference not on variety capitalism, but on the commonalities of capitalism. If Germany is being badly affected by the crisis, then that can't be because of superior advantages of the German economy. It must be because there are certain common features of an economy that it shares with other capitalist economies. And so we see a switch from an interest in promoting the German model theoretically and in terms of policy recommendations to trying to understand the nature of capitalism more generally. It does require a re-engagement with Marxism and critical views, but that's not meaning that in his case he then sided with the left wing or critical positions, but it meant that he needed to redefine his critical stance on the nature and limits of the German model, its competitiveness and so forth. And I think that's where bringing both that changing theoretic and that changing conjuncture, we can understand his book on gekaufte Zeit, buying time. But now he is thinking about the nature of an economy, not from the viewpoint of industrial relations, from the viewpoint of the labor market, from the viewpoint of firm-based competitiveness, but from the viewpoint of the more macroeconomic and macro-political aspects. And then, of course, the nature of the tax state and the nature of fiscal crisis.
the changing nature of debt-credit relations, and above all, the rise of finance-dominated accumulation require, on his part, a shift in perspective. And I think truths are occurring there, as you've rightly summarized, a shift from the tax state to the debt state. I'm not so sure that's as much a radical shift as he believes, because the tax state always had the capacity to borrow money to raise public loans on the basis of its capacity to raise taxes. So it was never the case that all public expenditure had to be financed out of taxation. It could also be financed out of loans guaranteed by the state's taxing capacity. So I see a continuity between tax state and debt state, where that concerns public debt. The difference perhaps is during crisis, states socialize the losses of private debt, or at least of the private banks, which vastly increases the amount of public debt. And that then leads to consolidation. But one could very easily see this in the language of Philip Moravsky as never let a good crisis go to waste. But from a neoliberal viewpoint, the increase of public debt due to the socialization of the losses of the the losses of banks, and the ways in which that also reflects in part an increase in welfare state expenditure, is an excuse to ramp up, to reinvigorate, to reinforce neoliberal austerity. And of course, neoliberal austerity was also what was the hearts for reform. So although there seems to be a rupture, you could also see a continuity, which is simply reflecting a shift in the conjuncture. The other point, which I think is really interesting and relates to another set of points, concerns capitalism and democracy. And here, I think he's as much Weberian, possibly more Weberian, than he is Marxist in looking at the correlation between capitalism and democracy, and seeing economic crisis as a threat to democracy. But quite honestly, in a post-war perspective, it's a little late to discover that Germany is becoming an authoritarian state, or that other states are also going down the authoritarian statist road. So I hope that's enough of context for thinking about Wolfgang Streeck's ideas. The book itself is, of course, absolutely full of interesting statistical charts, empirical data, and so forth. And I think those can be useful, but I would prefer to put it into a different historical context in terms of a personal context, his intellectual and political trajectory, and to think about how one might recontextualize those data in a different way. I would make the same comment on Thomas Piketty's notorious or celebrated book on capital in the 21st century. Thank you for the data, but let's now think about how we might reinterpret them. In relation to Foucault and Gramsci, Foucault is a very complicated character. He says in one of his interviews that he makes fun of many of those who read his work by citing Marx in words without ever citing Marx actually by acknowledging the influence of Marx. And there's some very fine work that's been done on discovering or uncovering some of the Marxist influences in his work. And I think we can certainly read Foucault's work from this perspective as one of several perspectives on his work. You mentioned biopolitics in particular, and I think that if we take a Marxian viewpoint, then this is also the viewpoint of reproduction. It's the viewpoint of the reproduction of the labor force as a fictitious commodity, not only on a day-to-day basis, but also over the life course and in intergenerational terms. So biopolitics is in part a way of thinking in slightly different terms about the role of the state in the extended reproduction of the labor force and the wider population. The additional factor, of course, is that Foucault is interested not merely in biopolitics from the viewpoint of labor as a fictitious commodity, whether over day-to-day life course or intergenerationally, but also from the viewpoint of the population as a key element in the nature of the state territory, state apparatus, state population. So a large part of biopolitics is also looking at the nature of biopolitics from the viewpoint of security and territory. But I see that as inviting an interesting dialogue between biopolitics as the politics of the expanded reproduction of the labor force and biopolitics as the expanded reproduction of a compliant and appropriately ordered population within the framework of the state. In relation to the second point that you made, does Foucault buy into the separation between the market and the state, and does he over-identify with the idea of homo economicus and over-identify with Chicago neoliberalism or possibly Freiburg ordo-liberalism? I think there's some interesting work that you could read in the journal Foucault Studies, which is an online journal, where precisely some of these issues are raised. There's a particularly interesting article by Uta Tellman, who's a German scholar, on the nature of Foucault's views on homo economicus and where that comes from. And I think that's possibly more critical than your question implies. And then finally, in terms of the Foucault-Gramsci connection, I think we might be better placed, we would get more interest in this looking not so much at Foucault and Gramsci. I was taking there the idea of governmentality and saying that was consistent with Gramsci's ideas about state equals political society plus civil society, but there are certainly some very interesting convergences between Poulanzas's work on state power and how one would understand the new modalities of the exercise of state power, and some of Gramsci's work, Foucault's work on discipline, normalization, and I think one might add biopolitics and anatomopolitics, but always in the context of how these are related to the state as the site of the strategic codification of power relations, and how, in Foucault's terms, you get this in the book on territory security, how the state effect is produced as the result of a multiplicity of micro-level, meso-level practices that give some degree of unity to state power as a functioning state apparatus. And a final point, Foucault doesn't really deal with issues of internationalization, global governance, the world market, the world of states, and so forth. So sorry, two very long answers, but hopefully they've been illuminating, and now we can move to some more questions.
Thank you for this extensive answer, and we have at least one question, so go ahead.
Okay, hello, Professor Bob. My name is Artan Sadiku from the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities in Skopje, in Macedonia. Well, my question does not relate actually directly to the treatment of state by different state theories and approaches, but I was thinking as you were speaking and doubting whether that question would have some relevance for the very theoretical features of the state theory. Indeed, and basically it is linked to the concrete regional experiences of where I come from, Macedonia. And actually, indeed, if we consider the state within this theory that was presented yesterday and today as a condensation of social forces and relations and assemblage of institutions, that would somehow imply that we always have a state with different modes of its appearance, which are contingent to the basically concrete local configurations of those social forces, and that we already have always a sort of power block which organizes the state power and so on. But my question is then, having into consideration the regional experience where I sort of could witness what happened in Albania in '97, how do we apply sort of these conceptual approaches to the issues of failed states? And one of those examples would be Albania. Can we say that what are the sort of theoretical implications for this sort of for this concrete approach of state theory with regard to social forces at that point in time when we actually sort of effectively have a failed state? No one is there to sort of exercise state power to organize anything within a certain territory, but we have smaller groups controlling smaller territories, or basically whether this is a case when we can consider this failed state as a particular mode of state where, I don't know, social forces have been are in a halt and nobody can sort of establish a power block. I was just thinking from this point of view, from the concept of from the experience with state failed states, what would the implications be for this sort of conceptual framework of state theory, and what happens, what is at stake at that moment with social relations and with institutions which should form the assemblage which manifests itself as a state? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. It's absolutely excellent question, and it reinforces the point that we have to see the state so we have to see the state as a social relation. In other work that I've done, taking the general state theory perspective on the state, that there is a territory controlled by the state, and an apparatus that makes collectively binding decisions, and a resident population. Each of these is rather improbable. And even on those terms, we could say that the extent to which the state exists depends on the extent to which the territory associated with a national territorial sovereign state is really controlled by that state or not. So one can imagine a wide variety of different ways in which either the territorial boundaries or frontiers are contested, that the territory is not, in fact, homogeneously ruled by the state, but there are center-periphery relations or degrees of fragmentation or the development of secession movements, each of which calls into question the territorial integrity of the state. The state has both an internal and an external face. So even if the territorial boundaries of the state are accepted as legitimate internally, there's no reason why that also means that the territorial boundaries or frontiers or borders of the state are accepted by other states or other powers, which is, of course, one of the reasons why so many territorial disputes occur. If we take the viewpoint that the state is also an apparatus that makes collectively binding decisions, as I've already indicated, it's highly improbable that this state, which is not in fact a state, but an assemblage or an ensemble of power centers, departments, apparatuses with different powers and capacities, really functions as a unity. It's always amazing, it's always improbable that the state acts as if it is one subject. That has to be produced in and through struggle, in and through hegemony, in and through the development of a state project that defines the nature and purposes of the state in ways that
state managers and so forth will accept. So that's another way in which the state can start to fail. And then finally, there's the resident population subject to state authority. And absolutely no guarantee again that the population subject to state authority is willing to accept that authority, to accept the particular forms of the state and so forth. So even that very crude, rather formalistic definition already indicates some of the ways in which the state can fail. It's an important part of my argument, but I'm only borrowing that also from Marx or from Lenin or from Gramsci, who after all was talking about a failed state when he examined Italy, or Poulanzas and others, that the state is not something that is formed once and for all, but is always in the process of formation and reformation. And in that sense, that's always contested. Nikos Poulanzas described the reproduction of the state as the expanded reproduction of class relations and class struggle. And I think we can make the same point. Now, if the PowerPoint is still up, I'd like to move you to slide number 35. And I'll go there myself. Okay. So it's the three formal dimensions. Okay. And this gives me an opportunity to say a little bit more in response to this question. You see that if we look at the first slide is the three formal dimensions: modes of representation, modes of articulation, modes of intervention. And on the right-hand column, I've got key crisis aspects. So crises of political representation, in terms of crisis of parties, in the crisis of the legislature, social movements, and so forth. That certain groups are not being represented and resent that. Certain groups are overrepresented, and that causes difficulties. In terms of the modes of articulation, there's the crisis of integration, institutional integration, the tendency to the disunity of the state apparatus. And I think it's highly improbable that a state apparatus ever functions in a unified manner, given all of the internal fractionings and all of the difficulties that exist there, especially when we see the state at a national level is integrated into an international order, which is also in turn a source of pressures on internal unity. What's going on in a national state, what goes on within the European Union, is not purely internal to the national state apparatus or the European state apparatus, because it has links with apparatuses, with architectures elsewhere. And again, modes of intervention, the possibility of what Jürgen Habermas calls rationality crisis or state failure in terms of its ability to intervene and to shape and to realize its objectives. Even more interesting, I hope, is the next slide, which deals with the three substantive dimensions: the social bases of the state project, and hegemonic visions. And if we look at that, again, you can see key crisis aspects. The crisis of the power block, as Gramsci would put it, the state of disaffection with parties, with social movements, with the state. The Germans have two fantastic words for this: Staatsverdrossenheit and Parteiverdrossenheit, the state of being fed up with the state of being fed up with political parties. And this is certainly a key feature of the potential disruption and breakdown of the social bases of the state mobilized behind it in terms of its legitimacy and so forth. In terms of the state project, again, a legitimacy crisis, an internal loss of faith in state projects on the part of state managers, those working at different levels of the state apparatus, and that then in turn has broader repercussions. Revolutions occur most often when the military no longer have faith in the nature of the state. If the military don't go over and the police don't go over, states tend to be able to reimpose their authority. But when even those that are employed with the state, within the state, lose faith, you have real difficulties. There can be differences between when sergeants lose faith, colonels lose faith, and generals lose faith from an army viewpoint, but the same phenomena, the same tendencies are evident elsewhere. And then finally, there's the crisis of hegemony, the wider loss of faith in the hegemonic vision. So I think a general approach to the state, general state theory, and a reinterpretation of that in terms of the strategic relational approach, always identifying, even at the level of form, potential crisis tendencies, helps you to deal with that. And finally, you mentioned failed states, and I don't know whether you mentioned rogue states. I think failed states one can analyze in a scientific way along the lines that I've indicated, but we must also be aware that failed states is a geopolitical ideological term that is used to justify the punishment or the intervention by some more powerful states into the internal affairs of others, humanitarian intervention, sometimes merely military, geopolitical, geoeconomic intervention on the others. So whilst I think it is worthwhile thinking about crisis tendencies, failure tendencies, we have to be very careful not to buy into or to accept the politico-ideological use of the category failed state in order to make political judgments or to justify external intervention, whether it be by the United States, the European Union, or other states. And then rogue state is a particularly nasty term because it simply means states that don't accept the hegemony of the United States or Europe get to be called rogue states. And here I side with Noam Chomsky and with, I think it's William Bloom, who have both written books on the rogue state, arguing that the United States is the biggest rogue state in the world. So I hope some of those comments will be useful and be an encouragement to go back and look at the slides that I presented in terms of things I didn't mention before, but it might be useful for some of your other debates and discussions. So for the next question?
No, I think we are out of time. And I want
You're probably exhausted as well, right?
We have a lot to think about.
Yep.
I want to thank you for your lecture and for the extensive answers. And I want to thank the audience for being so attentive. And see you soon, I hope.
Yes, okay. And what I will do is to send, in the light of your questions, 3 or 4 more papers that can be circulated to all of the participants.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very sorry that I missed it, but if there is another invitation in future, I look forward to coming and meeting some of you in person. So over and out from me, and have a good evening.
Good evening. Thank you.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Excellent. Afternoon, but some pointers perhaps for you to think about at a later stage. So I'm first going to ask the question asked of almost anybody who declares themselves to be a state theorist, which is, well, exactly what is the state? And I think that many state theorists will admit that this is the most difficult question that they have to confront. So I'll spend some time discussing the nature of the state and state power, and in that context refer to the difference between national and nation states, an important issue for thinking about the nature of the European Union, and also for thinking about the impact of globalization or internationalization or transnationalization on the form of the state and on state capacities in the current period.
I'm then going to ask what I think is a very useful question, originally posed by Evgeny Pashukanis, a Russian Marxist lawyer and state theorist, about the particular form of the capitalist state, and provide some initial answers. I'm then going to note some limits of this kind of form analysis and move to the work of Gramsci and Foucault, and then the work of Poulantzas and the ways in which I've developed the ideas of Gramsci, Foucault, Poulantzas, and many others. Namely, I shall be introducing the strategic relational approach, and then I'll be indicating some ways in which it might be applied. So we'll move to the next slide now. The question, what is the state? I've been working on state theory since 1974, more years than I care to remember. And after many attempts to identify a good entry point, I've come back to a view associated with what the Germans call allgemeine Staatslehre. And as you read it, emphasized every one of the terms that's written there in italics is contested, either theoretically or indeed in terms of everyday political struggles and in terms of ruptural moments. We're even coming up with a very general definition of the state or general definition of statehood doesn't take us very far. It helps us to identify the points of contestation, the points of struggle in relation to the state and state power. It doesn't establish a definition or a reference point that can simply thereafter be taken for granted. Now I'm coming to the national state and the nation state. In many European languages, there's a failure to distinguish between the nation state and the national state. And I think this is a major problem, not only in dealing with the territorialization of political power, but also seeing it's at stake when one discusses the nature of the European Union as a state in the process of formation, for example. So a national state, signified here by the frontispiece of Hobbes's Leviathan, can be described as a sovereign territorial state constituted on the basis of a successful claim, internally and externally, to exercise the legitimate monopoly of organized violence in its territory and to use it to govern its population. There are many national states, but not all national states are nation states. Next slide, please. And here I would identify or define a nation state as a territorial state constituted on the basis of an existing nation or one that seeks to legitimize.
This is our last lecture, obviously, and we are doing it via Skype. And we are also taping it at the same time. So I'm a bit excited. This is the closest thing to neurosurgery that I've been to. And I hope that this goes well. Our last speaker is Bob Jessop, currently in England. And he will be giving a talk on entitled States and State Power, a strategic relational approach. So I don't want to waste any more time, and I will now give a word to Professor Jessop. Afterwards, we can have also a discussion via Skype if the connection lasts that long. So I think that all the technical prerequisites are in order, and I think we can begin. Professor Jessop.
Okay, thank Thank you very much, and thank you for agreeing to listen to my presentation via Skype. I'm very sorry that I wasn't with you for the last 2 days, but I was unable to participate, but I'm aware of the lecturers who've already spoken to you. In fact, I know them all very well as personal friends, so I can imagine some of the conversations that you've had. Because I'm not with you in person, although I have a long PowerPoint presentation, I'll try to keep my presentation fairly brief to enable you to have a proper question and answer session, because I think that's a more useful way to take advantage of my presence via Skype than for me to give you a long lecture. I've already agreed that the PowerPoint presentation could be made available to you later, so you don't need to make extensive notes, but just try to concentrate on the points that I'm making and where you agree or disagree and would like to ask questions. So you've seen the front page, and this is the outline of the full presentation. Not necessarily what it is that I'm going to say, this territorialization of political power on its claim to form a nation, an imagined community. Not all nation states or potential nation states are national states. In the current era or the current period, for example, Kurdistan, which is potentially a nation state, is divided among 3 national states, each of which has very distinct views on whether or not the Kurds have a right to nationhood. If one looks at a very strong sense of Kurdish national identity, clearly there is at least the basis of a legitimate claim there. And I'm speaking to you, of course, in the former Yugoslavia, which was a multinational state and broke up over issues of national identity, even though Yugoslavia was a national state in terms of national territorial statehood. Now I'm moving to the slide on the European Union, and we can ask, in the light of the features that I've identified of states, national states and nation states, where does the European Union fit in? And of course you've heard John Cananculan and Jens Wissel talk about this already, and I believe from the abstract that Werner Bonefeld has also spoken on this. From my viewpoint, the European Union is a state in the process of formation. That is to say, it's an attempt to establish a new mode of the territorialization of political power, a new mode of territorialization that differs from empire or multinational or federal states. It's neither a national sovereign state nor a nation state. It's acquiring more formal powers, and efforts are being made to create a European cultural and political identity. And you will have heard from John and from Jens in their respective presentations about all of them, which can simply be called general state theory. And what that identified 3 aspects of the formal characteristics of the state, namely that the state has a territory controlled by that state. It has an apparatus that makes collectively binding or authoritative decisions, and it makes them over a resident population subject to state authority. Perhaps several of you, many of you even, may be familiar with that from the work of Max Weber or from law or from more contemporary theories. That said, it's quite clear state capacities and state strength vary a great deal. There's obviously no general form of the state, and in particular, there are very big differences even within the same broad kind of state. Let us say a capitalist state in their policy regimes, and that indicates that there can be no general theory of the state in general. Perhaps in the United Nations, and not even there, all states are equal. But as George Orwell would perhaps have said, while all states are equal, some are more equal than others. And that's an additional issue for those interested in state theory, namely to explain why some states have more power than others to shape the world order, and in addition to explain the bases of state strength, which are not merely in terms of welfare, but also in terms of military power. I'm now going to offer a definition of statehood, of the general characteristics of the state. The Germans refer to this as Staatlichkeit. Statehood is not such a common word in English. And we can say that statehood is territorialized political power. And I will just invite you to read the paragraph that's there in the middle of the slide,